Good morning, everyone. I'm Ed Carney. I'm Apple Valley Chamber President, and I want to welcome you to our Real-Time Solutions. Real-Time Solutions, it's brought to you by 5 different chambers of commerce working together, and that's Apple Valley Chamber of Commerce, Burnsville Chamber of Commerce, Hastings Chamber of Commerce, Lakeville Chamber of Commerce, and River Heights Chamber of Commerce. And our series sponsors is Xcel Energy, who you see their logo there. Xcel is a strong advocate for all of our businesses, and we want to thank them for being our series sponsors all along here now. Thank you very much, Xcel. The goal of these series of the Real-Time Solutions is in order for us to address business concerns both during the pandemic, but also during this critical recovery period that we're entering into right now. All of you will remain muted. Also, type your questions into the Q&A on your screen, and we'll monitor that. For after Nicole does her presentation, we'll have about a 10-minute Q&A session. And again, you are being recorded, and this recording can be found on all of our chamber websites and also our social media. I'd like to introduce Nicole Trousseau, partner in Faegre Drinker Law Firm. And Faegre Drinker is the largest law firm in Minnesota with over 300 attorneys, 1,300 around the country, and with 22 locations, and they even have locations in Europe and Asia. And Nicole, thank you very much for being here. You're a graduate of St. Benedict, also your University of St. Thomas School of Law degree. And Nicole here counsels in employment issues, and her focus is really on practical solutions for all of us. And that's what businesses like to hear, practical solutions. Just to give you a sample of what she's an expert in: hiring, drug tests, background, privacy issues, non-discrimination issues, contracts, separations, handbooks, confidentiality, etc. I know that you're a super lawyer. I read your background, and you've had some of your main clients over the years have been Deluxe, Polaris, etc. Just a litany of clients, and right down to the very small businesses like many of us on this particular webinar as well. So I think it's high time we got started, no pun intended. And let's talk about the legalization of marijuana and business liability. Thank you very much, Nicole, for joining us. And I know you have a PowerPoint presentation you're about to go to.
Yep, so I'm gonna pop this up on the screen here so that you've got some information on the slides. This is really a key topic for a lot of businesses right now, particularly as we're looking at this latest session here in Minnesota and what seems to be a path forward for the legalization of recreational marijuana. So we can certainly get into the weeds, and Ed says, no pun intended, but this is certainly a topic that's ripe with puns, and so certainly we'll hit some of those as we try and keep this discussion lighthearted and interesting as we go through it. But what we're seeing here in Minnesota is really something we've seen all around the country on the legalization of marijuana, both in medical and recreational forms. And it's something that employers have been grappling with from the employment law perspective, but businesses are also considering how this comes into play in all aspects of what we do. And I think we will certainly see that push over the next few years here in Minnesota, even if this upcoming session isn't the one to get it passed. This has been a topic that certainly chamber members have been interested in for a number of years. I think this is probably my 6th or 7th time at various chamber chapters and at the state level talking about these issues, going all the way back to 2014 when we saw medical marijuana legislation passed here in Minnesota. So just a level set with all of us here on the phone, here in Minnesota, we've already got some medical marijuana legislation that has been in place back to 2014. What that has primarily done is limited the access to marijuana to just people with certain specific conditions. And over the last few years, we've seen those conditions modify, but initially businesses were, I'll say okay, but that's maybe a strong word. We're accepting of the medical marijuana provisions because we thought it would be limited to just certain conditions. And really, those people were people who had terminal type conditions where we didn't think this would actually come into the business workspace all that much. As the conditions have expanded, that has started to bleed into business operations much more significantly. And what's important about the medical marijuana legislation that we have here in Minnesota is that we actually have some employment discrimination protections built in. That's different than a lot of states, but Minnesota is actually quite restrictive as to how employers can treat their own employees who have medical marijuana prescriptions, particularly in the conditions of hiring and firing as related to drug tests. And so those have become key for businesses to keep in mind, particularly as those conditions have expanded. What has remained in place with our current legislation is that Minnesota actually does have a fairly restrictive medical marijuana law, and that's because of the forms of marijuana that are permitted to be used. So even if you're a registered patient under our law, you can't actually smoke marijuana in sort of the traditional form that we're seeing as the illegal drug. And so that's what's really provided some comfort, is that it's much easier to monitor when the prescription is in limited form. On the reverse side of that, the push for expanding marijuana access here in Minnesota has really been to the fact that it is restrictive. There are complaints that our programs are expensive, that it limits access to only those who have the ability to pay for those resources. And that makes it really difficult to get this in the hands of people who need it. And so we've seen bills proposed over the last several years trying to push for recreational marijuana, which would then expand the accessibility of marijuana for medical conditions as well. But those have really come forward with limited success. And this 2021 bill that's now through the third committee is actually the farthest we've seen these bills move, and certainly the most detailed of those bills. And so something where if it doesn't happen soon, it looks like it's going to come along quickly in the next session or two. So something for us to keep in mind as we certainly look at how this could come into play for Minnesota businesses. We're not the only state that's looking at marijuana expansion. We currently have 16 states who have recognized recreational marijuana, including DC. 36 states have put into place legalized medical marijuana. And for this upcoming session, over 16 states have some sort of marijuana legislation on their docket. So Minnesota's not the only state that will be looking at this issue. You'll see changes all over the country. And that's part of the push we're getting in Minnesota right now. South Dakota actually passed this as part of their ballot in the fall. And so you'll see some of the commentary is, well, if people can cross into Wisconsin to get fireworks, they're certainly going to cross over to South Dakota to get marijuana access. So the continued push for this around the country is really what's pushing Minnesota to put some sort of restrictions in place in the hopes that it doesn't become a free-for-all as our neighboring states support that. So if we look briefly at this current bill, what the bill really does is to set recreational marijuana up as almost like alcohol. So the bill proposes that those who can purchase will be 21 or older, purchase or possess. And it starts to control the form of packaging, the labeling that has to be on it, how it can be advertised, but really looking at things like alcohol and tobacco as the model for how marijuana can be used from a recreational standpoint. A couple other things that are buried a bit in the law that may not stand out right away, that it actually does broaden the medical use of marijuana. So now if you have an employee who's in your workforce who has a medical card, they will be able to use it for smoking or vaping if the bill gets passed in its current form. What's also key for businesses is the bill actually modifies another law, which isn't typically seen when we think about marijuana use, but we've got a law here in Minnesota called the Lawful Consumable Product Protection Statute. And this bill calls marijuana use out as specifically a lawful act in Minnesota, which has a couple of implications. So the way the lawful consumable product law works is that it says an employer can't refuse to hire you, discipline, discharge, terminate you because you've engaged in the lawful use of consumable products outside of the workplace, outside of working hours. So what that typically means is if your employee drinks alcohol and they're over the age of 21, we can't fire them on the job for that outside activity that's lawful. Same with tobacco use. This bill would actually make marijuana a lawful substance for this purpose, which means we couldn't terminate an employee because they used marijuana outside of the job, with just a couple of exceptions. So you could penalize a worker if they came to work impaired by that use of marijuana, or if they used, possessed, sold, transferred marijuana while they were on the job. And so it does provide those exceptions for you. I think for many businesses, the issue is really the practicality of how this works. The other key issue with the current bill is that it changes our employer drug testing and alcohol laws. So under this bill, employers would not be allowed to test for marijuana unless it was required by state or federal law. That means we couldn't test before employment for marijuana use. We couldn't test solely for the purpose of determining if someone was using marijuana, and we couldn't randomly test for marijuana use. So that substantially changes drug testing in the workplace, particularly because the only time we'd be allowed to test for marijuana is if we had a suspicion that someone was actually impaired by marijuana or that they violated a work rule, going back to that transferring, selling on the job. There are a few exceptions under the proposed bill for safety sensitive positions. So if you had someone who was involved in face-to-face care of vulnerable adults or in a healthcare setting, we could actually test for marijuana in those circumstances. And this is where our bill differs from a lot of the bills for recreational marijuana around the country. We've actually seen a lot of bills passed in states and local municipalities that don't have these safety sensitive exceptions. So if I said one good thing about the proposed bill, it's that we do have some carve outs built in here, which I think for businesses can give us a lot of comfort that if we do have some challenges and concerned about someone's ability to perform their job, we could have it out in the ability to test. Now, from my perspective, I'd like to see that list expanded to include other types of positions. But it's certainly a start and does give us some security as business owners and operators that we do have protections for those we fear could injure others in the process. So what doesn't the current bill do? And I think this is what's really important to all of you on the phone. There are still a lot of open issues for businesses when looking at this current bill. And I think part of that challenge is we don't have developed law on this. We don't have developed law under medical marijuana protections. We don't have developed law in the state that really gives us guidance on how this is going to play out from a practical standpoint. I think the most clear example of how this will impact businesses is there's just no standard measure of impairment for marijuana purposes. There's no reliable testing metric to what constitutes impairment, unlike alcohol. And that's what makes this really challenging. You could have two people use the same amount of marijuana and come up with widely different answers on how that impacts their impairment and their functioning. It can depend significantly on the periods that they've used marijuana. So because marijuana stays in your system for a number of weeks, there's actually a buildup. So the longer you use marijuana, if you're a repetitive user, that means your results on a drug test will be significantly higher than someone who's just used it once or twice. And so you see varying levels of testing amounts that come out of your drug screens that don't really tell you much of anything. We've certainly seen some states that have tried to put it into place DUI type limits for marijuana use, but really that's an imperfect science. It's not like a breathalyzer. And so we've got some examples of that, but I think we've seen in other states, it really really doesn't tell us much of anything. And so when we talk about when you as a business can take action against your workforce for marijuana use, you're told that you can only do that if they're impaired by marijuana, but we have no way of telling when an impairment is. So practical challenges that we'll have to see play out if a bill like this gets passed, and certainly headaches that it will cause for businesses as they try and comply with the laws and figure out what restrictions may be in place. The important thing to note is that we still have federal protections in place. Marijuana still remains illegal under federal law. And so even in the current version of the bill, if there's a requirement under state and federal law that you test for substances, or you have federal funding coming through your business, you may not be bound by the restrictions of the medical marijuana law. So a perfect example of this is DOT. If you have DOT drivers working for you, they are subject to the DOT regulations. They will be tested for marijuana on those DOT tests, and you can take action against those individuals who test positive for marijuana, even though it's a legal substance here in Minnesota. So that's an important note, but the federal funding piece is also a part of that. You certainly still have federal contractor requirements that come into play through the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act that would require you to maintain a drug-free workplace, including prohibiting marijuana in the workplace. So still some key exceptions, things that will come into play even if a bill does get passed, like it's being proposed here in Minnesota. We've got some other laws that come into play here and discrimination protections that are related to marijuana use that we've certainly play out with marijuana use. And that primarily relates to disabilities. So under the law, employers are required to not only not discriminate against those with disabilities, but to make reasonable accommodations for those who have disabilities in your workplace. Under the federal discrimination protections, those with a disability don't include those who are using illegal drugs currently. Now, there's some provisions for recovering addicts and those who have gone through substance abuse treatment, but under the federal law, we would not be required to accommodate someone who had a disability in the use of using marijuana. But the juxtaposition of that is that under state law, we have the same accommodation requirements that come into play here. But under state law, this would be legal if a bill was passed. And so while you may not have obligations under the federal law to allow your employees to use marijuana, you may have some obligations under state law. And that's one of those open issues where the bill doesn't expressly address that, but we can see how that is likely to play out because it's an open issue. So we'll likely get some lawsuits trying to dictate what that will look like for businesses going forward. The practical implication of marijuana passage, because of the way the bill is structured and the limits on drug testing that are likely to come into play, are more significant here in Minnesota because we really do have restrictive drug testing laws as it relates to businesses. And so the way this really would play out for employers from a practical standpoint is your frontline supervisors are really going to become the answer and the key point in your operations to ensure that you don't have employees or others in the workforce who are impaired by marijuana if it becomes legalized on a recreational basis. Under Minnesota law, if we were to test for someone, we can't even terminate an individual based on a first-time positive test. They have an opportunity to explain their results. They have the opportunity to seek treatment. It's only after a second positive test that you can actually terminate those individuals' employment. Under the new bill, not only would we still have those restrictions in place to give people a second chance, but we couldn't even terminate for marijuana usage unless we had that impairment aspect in play here. And so what becomes really, really important is, can you take action against individuals within your workforce before you get to the point of actually testing them? So are they violating a safety rule? Did they forget to do something from a performance perspective? Now, those observations from your managers on the ground become the key aspect to how we really make this work. So having strong policies, training those frontline supervisors to note signs of impairment, to note violations of your workplace rules and practices, so that you can really take action outside of the restrictions of whatever marijuana bill is passed and the confines of Minnesota law that are already in place. And I think that's where we get to some of those practical considerations that we have in place here. Where we're at in other states, we've always had the position that marijuana is illegal under federal law. And so employers and businesses were free to take action against their employees or other in the workplace based on marijuana use, because we could always maintain that it's an illegal substance. That tide's really changing. And certainly if this bill gets passed here in Minnesota, we will see that tide change here, and businesses will have their hands tied on how they can react to marijuana. This is really something that employers are going to have to grapple with from their workforce side, but you'll also see it just on the business operations side as you deal with other people who are coming into your business, and what does that mean for those restrictions. Again, if we go back to how this bill is structured, we really can start to think of marijuana like alcohol if this gets passed from a recreational standpoint. We have freedoms to take action against those who come into your workforce who are impaired by the use of alcohol or other legal prescription drugs. Same thing with patrons if you have a public-facing business. We treat it exactly the same. But I think that's a hard struggle for a lot of businesses, because it's just a new world. We don't have those strong tests that we can use. We don't have the long-standing rules in place related to marijuana. And so there will be a period of time where it will be uncomfortable. And that's really where we're at. We're dealing with this uncertainty that is coming forward through these bills, and a time when we really as employers are looking for those employees from a staffing perspective, from a retention perspective. We want to make sure we're building a strong workforce in safety issues. I think that's the other part of this that businesses really come to me with is, how do I make sure that my place of business is safe for all the folks involved, both our employees, but also customers and those we interact with in the public. Other things we see come out of states where recreational marijuana is passed are concerns from businesses about the healthcare costs. Will we see an uptick in our healthcare costs because of this? Will we see an increase in workplace accidents because of this? And really, I will say that the research is all over the board when we think about what are we seeing from a cost perspective for businesses. You'll find some say that there are an increase in workplace accidents. Others will say there's not an increase in workplace accidents. And so it's really something that's a bit muddy. We've had states like Colorado that had this in place for 7 or more years, and still pretty inconclusive results on what the ultimate impact is to business on that healthcare, workplace safety, workers' compensation type claims. But I think where we will see a lot of this drive is what we do know in those states is that the tax revenue coming from recreational marijuana is significant. And so there is this uptick in the amount of revenue that a state can get from recreational marijuana use that really starts to drive this, and hopefully will then flow back through businesses in other ways. So I see Ed popping in, which I know means we're getting close to the end, but happy to chat through some questions, as I'm sure many of you are grappling with these issues already.
Hi, let me start with one that you addressed a little bit a few minutes ago. We have Department of Transportation regulated employees, in other words, commercial driver's licenses, as a requirement for their employment. Can we have them take a drug screen prior to being hired?
Yes, and in fact, you will have to have them take that drug screen prior to being hired. So even under the current bill, those CDL drivers would be under the DOT regulations and not under the state regulations. So the Minnesota bill would allow you to test for marijuana for your DOT covered drivers, just as it always was.
Thank you. And here's another one. Will the safety sensitive also include operating of equipment?
Um, it, it may. So right now, it's a little bit unclear as to how that will come into play. We've certainly seen other states that have included a safety sensitive exception for operating heavy equipment. Things like construction generally falls under those safety sensitive roles. What's interesting is our marijuana law for medical purposes does not include any safety sensitive exceptions. So while the list is pretty limited right now, it's actually better than we currently have in Minnesota. And so it's some improvement, but I think that's an opportunity for improvements in this bill, is to focus on those safety sensitive roles, and particularly giving workforces, business owners, more flexibility in how they interpret it, safety sensitive roles.
Thank you. Here's a very specific question that somebody knows how these stores operate. Delta 8 weed is readily available and on sale at tobacco stores today with 7% THC and all of the cannabinoids and regular Delta 9 illegal weed. Do you see this new entry in the marketplace being a pathway for regular pot in Minnesota? And given the bill to legalize Delta 9 regular weed, do you think Delta 8 will be left alone from a regulator perspective?
That is very specific. We don't usually get into the details of particular brands. We certainly see sort of this gateway, and we were talking about CBD oils when we first came online here, but a lot of these, quote unquote, legal substances that remove some of the THC components are certainly a pathway. Under the current bill, obviously that will all come under the umbrella, and there will be restrictions on labeling and advertising and who can distribute. And so there are some potential improvements for those products as this bill comes into play, but it certainly opens the door, right? And I think the benefit of having a bill is that we start to regulate those and see the revenue from those a bit more clearly. But it's a crack open in the door that is certainly going to result in issues going forward.
Here's one that I was reading about. Positive, if you refuse a test, it's considered positive. So don't refuse a test. But secondhand smoke, let's say you're at a concert or something, or in a car with somebody, weight loss pills, poppy dressing, mouthwashes, ibuprofen, antidepressants, antibiotics, and antihistamines can all cause a positive test. What do they do? Ask for another test? Or?
Yeah. So this is something, if you've got a vendor in place, these are questions to really address with your drug testing vendor. The way that a lot of programs are set up, particularly here in Minnesota, because we do have a restrictive testing law, is that many vendors will use a medical review officer. And so with those testing programs, when a positive test comes in, your medical review vendor, through your normal testing vendor, will actually work with those individuals who have had the positive test to say, can this result be explained through any other valid means? So it could be a prescription. They could tell you, here's what I ate for dinner last night. Here are the over-the-counter restrictive medicines that I'm on. And that medical review officer can then look at the test results and the proposed explanation and determine whether or not the story actually explains the test results. I will tell you, in my years of doing this, I've never seen poppy seed dressing or a poppy seed muffin result in a positive test. You would probably have to drink gallons of the dressing or eat a dozen muffins before you would get to that point. So I think a lot of these are excuses that we see come through when we get a positive test that actually don't play out. They're online stories. But for the most part, we don't see that.
It's ironic. It could have been the employer bringing those donuts that day, or the bagels or something. And then what about if somebody does fail a test, whether they work for you or they're just trying to get employment, and they fail it, and you get a call from another employer, you cannot tell them if anybody tested positive, correct?
Yeah, so this is an interesting issue. We don't have a specific restriction on what you can share with other employers. However, usually drug testing information is considered confidential medical information of your employees that should be kept confidential. The biggest legal risk to actually talking about it with another employer is a defamation type claim, where the employee or the applicant would say that that's not a true statement. They didn't give you the full side of the story. So from my perspective, I would tell you don't disclose that information because of the confidentiality and other legal risks. But it's not as clear cut as.
Thank you. And we have a few other questions here. A lot of questions. What are the stats from states that have legalized weed when it comes to employers testing? Data on how many have been terminated for positive weed testing? So basically, what are other states experiencing?
Yeah, so I think I've certainly seen trends. I don't have the numbers in front of me as to what that has changed, but I think what it really does do is it causes employers to question whether pre-employment testing is appropriate, because they have a hard time filling positions if they pre-employment test and things come back positive for marijuana. So we have seen a lot of employers say, you know, in certain locations, I'm not going to pre-employment test for marijuana at all, because I'm afraid I won't be able to fill my open spots if I maintain a hard line on that.
Thank you. Would legalizing marijuana for recreational purposes allow people to smoke it in public? Then second, like at an outdoor restaurant patio or in a public park where kids are playing, or online at a Dairy Queen?
I think there are certainly possibilities for that, particularly on the outdoor side. You know, the bill as it's written still allows people to restrict on private property. So as a business, you could say, you can't use or possess or sell on my property. And so you'll certainly have those rules come into play. And I think that's certainly important for you to look at from a policy perspective in your own businesses.
Okay, and then the effects of alcohol are similar in duration to THC effects on a person. However, alcohol dissipates more quickly in a person's saliva and blood, where weed remains up to 30 days. Given both are mind-altering drugs, how do you reconcile the regulation and employer testing in these states where weed is legal?
Yeah, that's exactly right on the difference between alcohol and marijuana. You can tell, you know, with relative certainty when someone has used alcohol, what their impairment level is, because we've had those standards developed through our law enforcement mechanisms. You know, marijuana is a much different beast, and I think we see much greater fluctuations in those positive test results and the numbers that come through on that. So they're similar in the sense that we're treating them the same from a legal substance perspective in those states with recreational, or here in Minnesota if that gets passed. But the testing challenges are certainly there. And we'd love for, you know, science to develop to have a more accurate zone of marijuana. But at this point, it's not clear to businesses what this person used, how long ago they used, how much they used, and what their impairment level is. So there's a distinction with alcohol that's hard to grapple with at this point.
Thank you. In many of our cities and the 5 chambers here, not all, but many of them, have city-owned liquor stores. If this is a controlled substance, how does that affect distribution? If a city were to control alcohol, then I assume they're going to be able to control marijuana. Would they have to sell that in their liquor stores, which ironically are to support police and youth programs? So
sure.
Part of it's optics. But is there anything that's happening in other states with city-owned liquor stores or state-owned liquor stores?
So most of these don't go into liquor stores. There's a separate licensing process that goes into place to, you know, get the right to sell and distribute. That doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but we generally see these as independent standalones. But it's certainly an option.
So in cases like that, a city might decide, oh, we just don't want it in our city, and they can do that. Okay.
Right. Yep. They could just not apply for the license for it. Yep.
I think that's all of our questions now. I'd like to thank you, Nicole, very much for taking the time. We know how busy you are.
No, happy to do it.
It was wonderful, and it's a really timely topic because we're all pretty sure it's not going to pass this session, but like you had said earlier, it's probably not far behind either. And those things have a
Yep.
way of happening all at once. We have to be ready for it. So thanks for having us prepared and thinking about these things early.
Absolutely.
These
And feel free to reach out if there are other questions that come up. I'm happy to chat through some of these issues if you have a note that comes up. And certainly if this is recorded and folks want to reach out, I'm happy to chat further.
they can ask a question without the lawyer clock moving financially, right?
Yeah.
Chance for a free question here. Again, this is brought to you by 5 chambers of commerce: Apple Valley, Burnsville, Hastings, Lakeville, and River Heights Chambers of Commerce, all working together to bring real-time solutions to you. And we'd especially like to thank our series sponsor, Excel Energy, who is really supporting businesses. And especially, they better be concerned about this. You don't want to be working on a high wire line and somebody getting high. With that, then it's been recorded. You'll see it on the websites of all of us chambers. And next is our session, which is a little bit different format like we did a few weeks ago. It'll be interactive. It's going to be April 13th that morning at 8 a.m. John Frowley, the director of the Minnesota Zoo, will do a behind the scenes tour for us for about 10-15 minutes, followed by our interactive coffee gathering virtually, where we all get to know each other, 5 different chambers, getting new customers, new friends. And that's exciting. You can meet some really fun people. We even do some breakout things for 5 minutes at a time and that. So don't miss that on April 13th. Put on your calendar at 8 a.m. Thank you very much, Nicole. This has been great. And we really especially hope to have you back in the future if this thing does start to become a live wire and it looks like it's going to pass.
I think so. Yeah. Happy to come back at that time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.